the millionaire sneered, humiliating the poor waitress. A $10 silver bracelet has found its way into my $10,000 gala dinner. The whole table erupted in laughter until his hearing-impaired mother stood up, tears falling as she saw it. And in that moment, the pride of the Ward family began to crumble. But if you think this is just a story about pity, you are gravely mistaken. Read until the end to find out what was truly happening. If I were running this company, I'd fire half the staff within a week. The statement burst from Ethan Ward's mouth amidst the crisp laughter of those gathered around the table. It was the Ward Atelier's gala dinner, the annual party for the luxury fashion conglomerate that Ethan himself had founded. The Glass and Gold restaurant was located on the 41st floor of the Metropole Hotel, overlooking the city skyline at night. The large glass panels reflected the golden lights, and the smoky, soft jazz music spread throughout the space. On the dinner table, expensive Cabernet Sauvignon shimmered in crystal glasses. The conversation revolved around sales figures, new collections, and upcoming advertising campaigns. Ethan sat at the center, 35 years old, in a perfectly fitted black suit, with sharp features and the gaze of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than listening. He was the type of man who commanded respect, not just for his power, but for the absolute coldness in his observation of everything. To his right was Vanessa Cole, a model, and his current companion. She was known for her sharp beauty and her habit of always wanting to be the center of attention. Her tight red silk dress and the faint scent of Chanel No. 5 permeated the air, overpowering the wine. Opposite him was Leon Hartman, the PR director, a man who always knew when to smile and what to say that Ethan wanted to hear. As the laughter subsided, Ethan lifted his wine glass, his voice composed. "The wine hasn't been poured evenly. Call a server." An employee approached, Lena Morales, a young woman around 26, in a simple black and white uniform, with her hair neatly tied back. Her frame was small, but her movements were slow and precise. She wasn't a permanent employee of the restaurant. She was working extra shifts in the evenings to send money home for her mother's medical treatment. Lena leaned over to pour wine for the guest at the head of the table. Her sleeve slid up slightly, revealing a tarnished, scratched silver bracelet, an old, simple piece of jewelry that looked utterly out of place amidst the crystal and diamonds filling the room. The light from the chandelier reflected off her wrist. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her lips curling slightly. Good heavens. $10,000 wine being poured by a girl wearing a $10 bracelet. The entire table chuckled. Leon chimed in. Ward Atelier truly embraces diversity. Even the accessory choices of the staff are varied. Ethan slightly curled his lip, offering a faint smile. Perhaps she thinks it makes her look classier. The laughter grew louder. The mixture of perfume, wine, and pretense became suffocating. Lena remained silent. She pulled her sleeve down, her voice soft, just loud enough to be heard. "Excuse me, I will bring more wine." She then took a step back, moving slowly toward the counter. Have you ever witnessed someone being looked down upon merely for their appearance? And in that moment, did you choose silence, or did you stand up? A nearby server quietly shook his head. No one intervened. Everyone understood in places like this. Silence was the only way to keep your job. Vanessa leaned in, lowering her voice. "See? The poor always have a strange kind of confidence. It's as if they think mere politeness is enough to enter our world." Ethan pressed his lips together, his smile fading. But in his gaze, something wavered. Scaredly, he watched Lena. She walked past rows of tables, her movements precise, nothing excessive or lacking. The silver bracelet caught the light again, a persistent, not shiny, light, like an object that had endured many years. A memory flashed through his mind, the image of a woman with neatly tied grey hair, her skilled hands soldering silver pieces in a small workshop. The firelight reflected, sparkling, just the same. Mother. He suddenly remembered those distant afternoons when he was a child, watching his mother work. A memory he thought he had forgotten. He lowered his eyes. Gripping the wine glass tightly, Vanessa noticed the change. Touching his arm lightly, "What are you looking at? Don't tell me it's the waitress." Ethan replied vaguely, his voice dry as metal. "No, just the reflection of the light." Leon laughed, raising his glass. "Perhaps the Ward Group is about to launch a product line for the working class." Vanessa burst into laughter, so loud that a few other tables turned to look. No, but maybe she could be the face of value savings. Laughter spread around the table. But this time Ethan did not join in. He looked down at his wine glass, the red liquid spreading on the table like a faint bloodstain. In the adjacent glass panel, his reflection looked cold and unfamiliar. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where Lena was adjusting the wine tray. The silver bracelet flashed again under the light. Ethan whispered softly, his voice barely audible, "Strange. Why does it look so familiar?" Vanessa tilted her head, still wearing the smile of someone who never felt safe enough. Familiar? With whom? Ethan? He didn't answer. A drop of wine fell from the rim of the glass, slowly rolled down the edge of the table, and dropped onto the floor. The sound was so faint that no one heard it, but Ethan felt it clearly, as if something had just cracked in his perfect world. No one knew why the light from an old silver bracelet made the heart of a young millionaire tremble for a moment, but sometimes the smallest things are the kindling that ignites a life that seemed programmed by reason. And that night, amidst the laughter of the elite, was the first night Ethan Ward truly heard silence. But he had no idea that the woman wearing that silver bracelet would cause his entire world to collapse, starting with just one glance. The restaurant glass door opened. A night breeze slipped through, bringing the city's chill. The rhythmic tapping of shoes echoed on the wooden floor, slow and steady. Ethan turned around, and his heart stopped mid-beat. Catherine Ward, his mother, was walking in. Her grey hair was neatly tied back. Her frame was small but exuded an innate elegance. She was accompanied by a nurse, her hand lightly gripping the man's arm for balance. In that moment, the jazz music seemed to fade, and the loud laughter around the table quietly subsided. Ethan immediately stood up, walking quickly toward his mother, his smile containing a strange mix of emotions, both relief and worry. "I'm glad you came. It's a bit noisy here. I'll arrange a quiet spot for you." Catherine smiled, her lips just moving, and then her hands moved gently in the air. "Just wanted to see you happy." Ethan understood immediately. He nodded, gently helping her to a chair near the wall where the light was softer, separate from the boisterous laughter. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, offering a polite smile, but her eyes held a look of irritation. "She actually came. I thought she didn't like noisy places like this." Her voice was soft, but laced with thorns. Catherine looked at her only once, her gaze so calm that it made others uneasy. Without words, her silence was enough to make Vanessa flustered. Ethan sat down, adjusted his napkin, and tried to soothe the atmosphere, but fate seemed determined not to let the evening pass peacefully. Lena entered, holding a silver tray with a new bottle of wine. The golden light reflected on her face, making her pale skin look even more fragile. She walked slowly, pouring wine for each person, her movements light, precise, nothing extra or missing. As she leaned over to the last guest, her sleeve slipped up, revealing the tarnished silver bracelet. The crystal light from the ceiling touched it, flashing strangely, a pure spark amidst a room full of gold and diamonds. Catherine froze. The smile vanished from her lips. Her eyes were fixed on the girl's wrist. The gaze was startled, trembling. Ethan noticed the change instantly. He leaned his head, his voice low. "Mother, is something wrong?" She couldn't hear, but her eyes spoke for everything. Her hands began to sign quickly, urgently. Ethan understood every movement, then turned to Lena, his voice deepening. "My mother is asking, where did you get that bracelet on your wrist?" Lena paused briefly. She looked at Ethan, then at the grey-haired woman who was intently watching her. The entire room seemed to freeze. The faint clinking of glasses sounded, then fell silent. She stood still for a few seconds, her hand gripping the silver tray tightly, her breathing heavy. Only when all eyes were on her did she finally answer, her voice small but clear. "Yes, I've had it since I was a child. It was a gift from a woman, but I don't know her name." Ethan turned back to his mother, translating with sign language. Catherine slowly shook her head. Then her hands moved again, quick, shaky, and filled with emotion. Ethan went silent as he understood. "My mother says she made that bracelet with her own hands." The space seemed to shatter in silence. A few whispers arose, then died down upon seeing Ethan's strained face. Vanessa glanced over, trying to keep her voice light but failing to hide her curiosity. "Your mother's missing silver collection, is that it?" Ethan frowned, his voice low and firm. "Vanessa, stay out of this." She fell silent, but her lips remained pressed together, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Catherine stood up. She walked slowly toward Lena, her eyes still fixed on the silver bracelet. The light reflecting off the table illuminated her face, making every feature tremble like an old photograph. She signed slowly, each movement heavy. "I carved my own mark inside. If it's truly mine, I will recognize it immediately." Ethan translated, his voice hoarse. She raised her hand, intending to touch Lena's wrist, but the girl stepped back. Her face suddenly turned white. She said nothing for a few seconds, only her eyes, filled with suppressed shame and fear. Then her voice broke out, trembling but resolute. "Please, ma'am, don't touch it." The air thickened. Lena took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "This bracelet is the only thing I have left. It was a gift from the woman who saved me." Everyone was stunned. A silver spoon dropped to the floor, clinking faintly, but enough to tear through the silence. Ethan did not take his eyes off Lena. The coldness had vanished from his face. Only confusion and emotion remained. Catherine trembled, her lips moving. Then she signed slowly, each word seemingly broken. "Saved you? How?" Ethan translated. Lena nodded slightly. "Yes. I don't clearly remember her face. I only remember she was wearing a bracelet just like this. And she carried me out of the orphanage fire that year." A tear rolled down Catherine Ward's cheek. Ethan looked at his mother and he knew. Something profound had just shifted within her. No one spoke. Vanessa started to open her mouth, but Ethan's gaze silenced her. Lena took off her apron, gently placing it on the table. Her movement was slow, stiff, but full of dignity. She bowed her head, then turned away. The light from the silver bracelet reflected one last time on the wooden floor, then vanished as the door closed. Catherine still stood there, her hands trembling in the air, trying to signal something but failing. A tear fell onto her wrist, right where the old scar was, where she had been burned while soldering the first bracelet. Ethan watched his mother in silence. She didn't speak, but her eyes were directed toward the door that had just closed, and in that gaze, he read an entire storm of memories. He whispered softly, translating his mother's hand movements in a hoarse voice. "That look, I've seen it before." No one in the room uttered a word. The jazz music returned, but no one was listening anymore. The room was still bright, but the light was no longer warm, and only Catherine, the woman who could not hear, was the one who most clearly perceived the sound that still echoed in that room, the sound of guilty silence. That night, as the lights dimmed, Catherine still looked toward the closed door where the woman who had saved a child years ago had just walked out, and within her, a question arose, keeping her awake all night. If I was the one who saved her, what did I lose in that fire? The restaurant door closed, leaving behind Lena, the faint jazz music, and the eyes that hadn't yet processed what had just happened. No one followed her. She walked straight, silently, each step heavier as her shoes hit the wet pavement outside the hallway. Everything behind her was enough to suffocate her. Inside the room, no one spoke another word. Vanessa sat back down. Her lips curled, but that brief smile vanished when she realized Ethan's eyes were no longer on her. He stood motionless by the table, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Lena had disappeared. The last light from the silver bracelet still reflected on the floor, shimmering like a trace of memory he couldn't understand. That night, the Ward family was engulfed in silence. The wind blew gently through the rose garden behind the house, damp and cold. But inside the study, Catherine remained awake. She sat by the old wooden desk in the study, a small lamp casting light upon a stack of oak jewelry boxes. On the table were old jewelry design sketches, yellowed with age. The ink lines blurred the handwriting of a woman who had spent her life engraving her stories onto metal. Her trembling hands slowly opened the lid of the third box. Inside were two identical silver bracelets, faded by time. On the inner side, a tiny symbol was engraved, an italicized K, framed within a flame symbol, her personal hallmark, and an empty spot where the third bracelet once lay. She lightly touched the empty space. Well, then signed, slowly. Her gaze distant. The nurse beside her didn't fully understand, only seeing her lips tremble, tears falling onto the bracelet. She was talking to herself in the language of memory. Ethan stood outside the door. He had heard the sound of the drawer opening long ago. He didn't call out, just leaned against the door frame, his eyes hesitant. He had thought his mother shouldn't have attended the party, shouldn't have let emotion get caught up in trivial matters. But now, seeing her sit alone in the small light, he knew there was something bigger than the awkwardness of the evening. He stepped in, speaking softly. "I'm sorry I let you see that. I don't know why she was wearing that bracelet. But please don't let it bother you." Catherine couldn't hear, but she looked up at her son with a gaze that made him stop. She signed slowly. "It's not just the bracelet. It's a piece of the past." Ethan looked at her thin hands, realizing for the first time that his mother was afraid, not afraid of losing something, but afraid of facing a memory. He sat down beside her, his hand lightly touching the jewelry box. "Is this the set of bracelets you donated to the charity fund years ago?" She nodded. Her hands continued to sign. 3 bracelets. 2 were given away. 1 was lost in the orphanage fire that year. Ethan froze. The orphanage. He vaguely remembered a major fire on the news when he was in middle school. His mother had apparently contributed to the rebuilding fund, but had never mentioned it again. She continued to sign, her eyes distant. "I was there that night. There was a little girl. I pulled her out. Afterward, I never saw her again." The room fell into silence. Ethan didn't dare ask more. He just looked at the 2 remaining bracelets, then remembered Lena's tears when she said, "The woman who saved me." He spoke softly. "Perhaps that was you." "Mother." Catherine shook her head. She signed, her eyes tear-filled. "Impossible. That child should have died." Early the next morning, sunlight streamed through the high windows of the living room. Ethan was still sitting there, sleepless, all night. He looked at the 2 bracelets, his mind spinning. He didn't understand why he felt so restless. That waitress, a person he had been cold to, a person he had carelessly insulted, was keeping him awake just because of one final glance. It wasn't pity. It was a feeling that something remained unexplained. He walked into his mother's room. She was still sitting in the armchair, awake, her eyes sunken. When she saw him, she signed, "I can't rest. I must know the truth." Ethan nodded. He didn't need her to explain further. He understood that gaze, the gaze of someone who had lost something that could not be bought back. He put on his coat, preparing to leave. She looked at him, signing one short sentence. "Where will you go?" he answered in a small, soft, yet firm voice. "To find the truth." "Mother." She didn't speak, just held his hand tightly. Ethan bent down, gently touched her hand, the hand that had made the bracelet, then left. On the way to the restaurant, the sky was still covered in a thin mist. Ethan stopped his car outside. Walking into the lobby, the restaurant manager recognized him, looking slightly flustered at his grave face. "Where is the waitress who wore the silver bracelet last night?" Ethan asked. The manager hesitated briefly. "She resigned this morning. Said she was moving. Didn't say where." Ethan was silent. He walked outside, looking down at the wet pavement, the spot where Lena had left last night. The early breeze blew through, carrying the distant sound of traffic and a nameless emptiness. It took a long breath, pulled out his phone, and called his assistant. "Michael, I need your help. Find a person named Lena Morales. She used to work at Glass and Gold." He paused, his voice lower. "And investigate everything about the orphanage fire 20 years ago." A few seconds of silence passed on the other end before the reply. "Understood, sir." Ethan hung up, looking up at the pale sky. For the first time in many years, he felt he wasn't in control of anything. Not contracts, not other people, but his own family's past. And somewhere in that morning light, he knew the story of the silver bracelet was not over. Catherine Ward's sleepless night became her son's torment. A bracelet, a memory, a glance enough to send both of them on a journey to reclaim what they thought was lost. Truth, compassion, and trust in one another. But Ethan did not know. The truth would not only come from the past, but also from a name buried for 20 years. Could Lena be the answer to the question his mother dared not ask for a lifetime? Ethan Ward's world seemed to have stopped. 2 days passed like 2 centuries. He sat in his office on the top floor of the Ward Atelier building. But he wasn't looking at growth charts or new designs. His gaze was fixed outside the glass, where the city stretched below, like a shimmering carpet of light scars. Everything felt meaningless. Vanessa had called 3 times. Her voice was still shrill, full of resentment, talking about the new collection launch, about the gossip after the party. Ethan only responded with short, cold replies before hanging up. The sound of that superficial world now grated on his ears. He only wanted silence. His mother was also silent. She sat in the study, beside the wooden box with the empty compartment, not speaking, not signing, just quietly waiting. Her silence was heavier than any reprimand. Ethan knew he wasn't just looking for the truth about a stranger. He was looking for the missing piece of his mother's memory, and perhaps a part of the conscience he had lost. Just then, his phone vibrated. It was Michael. "I found her, sir." Michael's voice sounded professional but urgent. "She lives in an old apartment complex on the west side of the city. Here is the address." Ethan jotted down the address on a piece of paper, his hand, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, now trembled slightly. He didn't know what he would say, what he would do, but he had to go. Have you ever wanted to apologize to someone, but didn't know where to start? The old apartment complex was located in a small alley, a stark contrast to Ethan's luxurious world. The scent of mildew and cooking faintly lingered in the air. He stood before apartment 4B. The wooden door faded. He took a deep breath and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Lena stood there, no longer in the neat uniform. She wore a simple grey t-shirt and loose trousers. Her hair hung down her shoulders, her face unadorned, her eyes sunken from fatigue. She looked much smaller and more vulnerable than she had that night. When she saw him, her eyes showed no surprise, only a fleeting coldness that quickly turned blank. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was flat, emotionless. Ethan felt his throat dry. The apology he had prepared suddenly sounded hollow. I came to apologize. Lena looked at him, a sad and mocking smile briefly appearing on her lips. The apologies of the wealthy don't heal wounds. Mr. Ward, they only make the wealthy feel better. She started to close the door. Wait. Ethan quickly put his hand out to stop the door. Lena, please. My mother. She can't sleep. She thinks she might be the woman in your story. That statement made Lena pause. Her gaze wavered. Her defenses seemed to crack, leaving a small opening. That has nothing to do with you, she said softly, but no longer as hostile as before. It does, Ethan said, his voice more sincere than ever. Because I insulted your memory. I turned your story into a joke. I was wrong. Just then, his phone vibrated again. It was still Michael, out of habit. He answered and put it on speaker so he could talk while holding the door. Sir, I just received the detailed report on the Santa Esperanza orphanage fire. Michael's voice clearly echoed in the quiet hallway. Lena flinched. Inga. Looking up at him, Ethan gestured for a minute, but Michael continued, his voice graver. The fire was caused by an electrical short circuit. Records show an anonymous woman rushed in and saved 3 children, including Ms. Lena Morales. That woman sustained burns on her arm. Ethan's heart constricted. The scar on his mother's arm. But there's a more important detail. Sire, the report clearly states that Ms. Lena Morales wasn't at the orphanage alone. She was there with her mother, who was a catering staff member at the orphanage. Ethan froze. He looked at Lena. Seeing her face turn white, Michael continued reading, unaware that his words were landing like a verdict. Both mother and daughter were rescued but suffered severe smoke inhalation. Subsequent medical reports noted that Lena's mother, Ms. Elena Morales, sustained permanent lung damage due to complications from the fire. The chronic respiratory illness she is currently being treated for is a direct consequence of that night. The space seemed to explode in silence. Ethan let go of the door. His phone slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a dry clack. He looked at Lena. A tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't sob. She just stood there, silently, letting years of pain be exposed to the light. Now he understood everything. He understood why she had to work extra. He understood why she treasured the silver bracelet so much. It wasn't just a relic of her savior. It was a testament to her mother's sacrifice, to the tragedy that changed their lives. And he, Ethan Ward, had made that tragedy a joke at a dinner table. He had called the symbol of all that pain a cheap item that makes her look classier. Remorse surged within him. Not just shame, but a feeling of disgust for himself. An apology now wasn't even enough to utter. It was too small, too shallow compared to the deep wound he had just inadvertently torn open. He started, then stopped. No words were adequate. Lena quickly wiped away her tear. Her voice was trembling, but the coldness was gone, replaced only by endless exhaustion. Now you know. Please, just go. She gently closed the door. This time, Ethan didn't stop her. He just stood there, immobile, staring at the faded wooden door that was tightly shut in front of him. He stood in the empty hallway for a long time, clearly feeling the collapse from within. He didn't just owe Lena an apology. He owed her and her mother a lifetime. Ethan didn't remember how he drove home. The familiar road suddenly felt strange, and the Ward Atelier building towering over the city now looked like a hollow monument, built on indifference. He walked into the mansion, the silence greeting him like a judgment. He found his mother in the study. She was still sitting there, next to the wooden box, her eyes looking out at the fading garden. When she saw him, she didn't ask, only looked at him with an expectant gaze. Ethan sat down, his voice hoarse. Mother, you were right. She is that child. He recounted everything Michael had found out, telling her about Lena's mother and her illness. He left out no detail, including his own vicious words. He narrated it like a confession. When he finished, Catherine slowly raised her hands. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were frighteningly still. She signed, each movement slow and painful. So, I saved the daughter, but I couldn't save the mother. The invisible burden of guilt weighed on both of them. One for his actions, one for her words. Both had failed in their own way. Ethan stood up. The shame within him had now turned into a cold determination. He wouldn't let things end here. An apology was not enough. Compensation with money would be another insult. He had to do something meaningful. He returned to his office, calling Michael. I want you to continue the investigation, not just the fire records. I want to know the cause of the fire. Which company was responsible for construction? Which company installed the electrical system? Everything. Don't miss any details related to the Santa Esperanza orphanage. This might take time. Sire. Michael hesitated. Records from 20 years ago are very hard to find. I don't care. Ethan growled. Use every resource necessary. I want answers. For the next 2 days, Ethan isolated himself in his office, flipping through all the operational records of the Ward Foundation from its early days. He read about his mother's charity projects, the places she had visited, the people she had helped. He was trying to reclaim the image of his family, desperately trying to cling to the good things his mother had built, as if they could wash away the stain he had just created. At the end of the second day, Michael walked into the room, his face more serious than ever. He said nothing, just placed a stack of yellowed documents on Ethan's desk. This is the final report from the fire investigation team. Sire. I found it in the city archives. Ethan opened the file. The smell of old paper hit his nose. He scanned the technical terms, the witness statements, and then stopped at the last page. The conclusion of the investigation. The cause of the fire was determined to be an electrical short circuit from substandard, non-compliant wiring. The construction contractor, Apex Construction, was found guilty of negligence, using cheap materials to cut costs. Ethan frowned. The name Apex Construction sounded familiar. Apex Construction. He muttered. Michael took a deep breath, his voice lowering. Apex Construction went bankrupt in 2002. Sire. But before that, it was a subsidiary. Ethan looked up, his eyes sharpening. A subsidiary of whom? Michael didn't dare meet his gaze. He pointed to a small line at the bottom of the construction contract in the file, where the name of the parent company that guaranteed the project was listed. Ethan's heart stopped. All the air in his lungs seemed to be sucked out. He stared at the clearly typed line. Unmistakable. The managing company, Ward Holdings. It was his father's corporation. The corporation that had laid the foundation for the empire he was inheriting. The twist of fate delivered a fatal blow. That fire was not a random accident. It was a direct consequence of his own family's greed. His mother, in a humanitarian effort, rushed in to extinguish a fire indirectly caused by her own husband. She saved Lena, but she couldn't save Lena's mother from the after effects of a tragedy whose roots lay with the name Ward. The silver bracelet his mother gave was a symbol of hope, but his father's legacy was ashes and illness. Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling like the world had just collapsed beneath his feet. He looked out the window, where the building, bearing his name, proudly stretched toward the sky. For the first time in his life, he saw the name Ward not as a symbol of power. It was a conviction, and the debt he had to pay was not just an apology. It was the debt of an entire generation. Ethan's hands gripped the old documents, the yellowed pages seeming to radiate the heat of the past fire onto his skin. He stood up, walking like a sleepwalker. Leaving his opulent office, he didn't go anywhere else. Just downstairs to the study, where his mother still sat motionless. His subsequent action was not a word, but placing the documents on the desk, right in front of Catherine. He flipped straight to the last page. using his finger to point at the line, Ward Holdings, the line that was both a seal and a scar. Catherine squinted, reading the line repeatedly. She didn't need him to explain. Her thin shoulders slowly slumped. The weight of 20 years of lies and forgetting crashing down on the woman who had spent her life trying to make amends for mistakes she didn't know she had caused. She raised a trembling hand, touched her husband's corporation name, then slowly pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes no longer tearful, only filled with an infinite emptiness. She signed, each movement slow and fragmented like a broken doll. "Did your father? Did he know?" Ethan shook his head, his voice strained. "I don't know. Father passed away 10 years ago. But it doesn't matter anymore." Silence enveloped the mother and son. It was no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of a grave, burying a terrible truth no one wanted to face. Their family legacy was not the skyscrapers or the luxury fashion brands. Their legacy was a scar. Just then, the study door burst open. Vanessa walked in without knocking. She wore a bright yellow dress, out of place in the gloomy space. "Ethan, I finally found you. Where have you disappeared to for 2 days? The press is buzzing. Leon is running damage control everywhere." Her voice stopped short when she saw Ethan's stone-cold face and Catherine's heavy gaze. On the table lay the old documents, something that didn't belong in her world of glamour. "Is this about that waitress again?" she whispered, trying to smile. But her voice trembled. "Honey, this has gone too far." Ethan didn't need to shout. He just stood up straight, nodded slightly, his eyes calm, and that calmness was the end. "Vanessa," he said slowly, "we are finished." She was stunned. A disbelieving smile appeared, then shattered. "Finished? Because of her?" Ethan replied, his voice even and low. "Not because of her, but because of me. I just realized the true cost of the life we have. It's built on lies, on the pain of others, on a fire that my family caused." Vanessa frowned, not understanding. "What nonsense are you talking about?" He shook his head slightly, no longer looking at her. "I only know that I can't continue living in a world where everything is judged by brand value. Your world is too small." "Vanessa." She stood frozen, then let out a sharp, grating laugh. "You will regret this." Ethan simply replied, "I've regretted enough already." There were no more exchanges. Vanessa turned away, slamming the door, the cold sound falling like the closing of a chapter. The room returned to quiet. Ethan stood there for a long time, then turned to look at his mother. Catherine had stood up. She walked over and hugged him, a tight trembling embrace, needing no words, only the shared burden of two people facing a heavy legacy together. In that hug, 2 generations of the Ward family cried not out of shame, but because for the first time they truly saw each other. When she let go, her eyes were different. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. She signed, "So now, what will you do?" Ethan looked straight into his mother's eyes. "I will return what my family took," he said slowly. "Not with money, but with responsibility." He pulled out his phone and dialed Michael's number. "Michael, cancel all meetings this week and contact the best legal team. I want to establish a new foundation, completely separate from the Ward Foundation. It will have one sole purpose." His gaze settled on the last silver bracelet remaining in the wooden box on the desk. "Its name will be the Silver Circle, and its first mission," his voice became steely, "is to find all the victims of the Santa Esperanza fire, so they can be cared for the rest of their lives." He paused, taking a deep breath, starting with Ms. Elena Morales. But Ethan didn't know that. As he decided to repay that debt, the fire of 20 years ago would flare up again, this time not to destroy, but to illuminate the path to redemption. Ethan didn't wait until the next morning. Right after the call, He had what he needed. The address of the hospital where Elena Morales was being treated. His next action was not a plan on paper, but him holding the patient information slip, stepping out of his luxury car, and walking into a completely different world. St. Jude Public Hospital was located in a working-class neighborhood, its walls faded, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and silent worry. This place had no glass walls or marble floors. It only had weary people fighting for their lives. For the first time, Ethan felt out of place, not because he stood out, but because his wealth here felt meaningless and crass. He didn't go into the room right away. He stood tucked away at the end of the corridor, looking through the small glass window. Inside, a thin woman lay on the bed, her hair nearly all gray. Elena Morales. A small breathing tube was attached to her nose, and the sound of the heart monitor was steady. Thunk. Each breath she took seemed like a struggle, a heavy effort against the after effects of the fire 20 years ago. And sitting beside the bed, quietly peeling an apple, was Lena. She no longer had the defensive or cold look, only boundless gentleness and patience as she cared for her mother. She peeled the apple skin into one long, unbroken strip, a meticulous habit to pass the time during stressful hours of waiting. Ethan stood there, watching the mother and daughter, and felt a stone pressing heavily on his chest. His father's corporation hadn't just burned down an orphanage. It had slowly burned this woman's lungs and consumed her daughter's youth. He took a breath, gathered his courage, and walked in. The sound of his footsteps made Lena look up sharply when she realized it was Ethan. Her hands, peeling the apple, froze. Her eyes briefly showed fatigue, then became wary. She put the knife and apple down, stood up, and positioned herself between him and her mother's bed. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was a whisper, but sharp. "This is not the place for you to seek peace of mind." "I didn't come here to seek peace of mind," Ethan replied, his voice deep and sincere. He looked straight into her eyes, not flinching. "I came to accept responsibility." Lena scoffed, a smile without joy. "Responsibility? How? Write a large check to compensate. My mother doesn't need your money." "I know," Ethan said, and this was the moment he broke every rule his world had taught him. "I didn't come here as Ethan Ward, CEO of Ward Atelier. I came as the son of the man who headed Ward Holdings." He handed her the copy of the old document Michael had printed out. "My father's company built that orphanage. Their negligence caused the fire." Lena was stunned. She took the document, her eyes quickly scanning the lines of text. Her hands began to tremble. This truth was more cruel than any insult. The one who pushed her family into tragedy and the one who reached out to save them, ironically, came from the same family. She looked up at him, her eyes no longer filled with anger, but with a profound pain, a complete shattering. "So," she said, her voice strained, "our entire lives were just a bookkeeping error for your family?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "That's not it. That's why I'm here. I've established a new foundation, the Silver Circle. It will cover all medical expenses for your mother. And for all the other victims, we will find the best doctors, the best treatments." He was speaking, trying to offer a solution, our tangible redemption. But Lena just shook her head, tears starting to flow. "It's too late. Mr. Ward," she said in a choked sob. "Why is it too late?" Ethan didn't understand. "We can... Don't you understand?" Lena looked at him, her voice breaking. "Your money can't buy back the most important thing. Last week, the doctor said, my mother's lungs are too weak to recover. Every treatment now is only to prolong her time." She turned back to look at her mother, who was drifting to sleep, her breathing still labored. And the worst part is, she knows. She heard it. Since that day, she no longer wants to fight. She says she's too tired. A final, Most brutal truth was revealed. Ethan stood frozen. His plan, his foundation, all his efforts at atonement suddenly became meaningless. He could pay for the hospital, hire the world's best doctors, but he couldn't buy back a person's will to live. He looked at Elena, then at Lena, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. The sound of the heart monitor in the room continued steadily, but to Ethan, it was no longer the sound of life. It was a countdown until the debt of his family would forever remain unpaid. Lena's crying gradually subsided. Only intermittent sobs remained. As fragile as her mother's breathing, Ethan stood there, in the cramped room, filled with the smell of antiseptic, feeling his presence was a burden. All his plans, all his attempts at atonement, suddenly felt meaningless. He could pay for the hospital, hire the best doctors, but he couldn't buy back time. He could leave. That would be the easiest thing. But the image of his mother sitting alone in the golden light, trembling as she signed the question, "Did your father know?" flashed through his mind. He knew. Another ward was not allowed to walk away. Ethan pulled the plastic chair from the corner of the room and sat down. He said nothing, just sat there, present in the pain of others. That silence lasted an eternity. Only the steady sound of the heart monitor and the wind seeping through the door crack remained. After a while, Lena looked up. Her eyes were swollen and red. She looked at him, the man who had once insulted her, and spoke softly. Hoarsely, "Why are you still here?" Ethan answered, his voice low and honest. "Because I don't know where else to go. And I don't think you should be here alone." Lena was silent. In that moment, her hatred didn't vanish, but it suddenly felt misplaced. She looked at the half-peeled apple on the table. The knife and the peel lay still, like a paused moment of life. Ethan walked over and picked up the knife. He said nothing, just bent down and continued peeling the rest of the skin. His movements were clumsy, the blade occasionally nicking the apple flesh. But he was patient. He cut the apple into small pieces, placed them on a plate, and pushed it toward her. Lena looked at him, her voice small, hoarse from crying. "Thank you." Those were the first two words she spoke without hostility. But when he sat back down, the silence returned. Lena looked up at the ceiling, her voice low, as if talking to herself. "I don't know whether I should be angry or sympathetic. But when I saw you holding the knife peeling the apple, I suddenly realized perhaps the anger in me is slowly getting lost." Ethan looked up. He said nothing, only his eyes, a gaze that listened. Time passed slowly. Elena on the hospital bed stirred slightly. The sound of oxygen was still steady. Fin. Lena stood up, wiped her tears, and walked over to hold her mother's hand. Ethan watched them. The feeling of remorse now, not of fear, but a reminder to act with more kindness. A little later, Elena opened her eyes. Her vision was cloudy, weak. As she looked around the room, "Lena, do we have a new doctor?" "Dear," her voice was a whisper. Lena bent down, smiling faintly. "No, Mother. This is Mr. Ward." The name hung in the air. Elena looked intently at Ethan, then frowned slightly. It wasn't the face that made her stop breathing. It was the silver gleam in his hand, where the tarnished bracelet faintly shone in the hospital light. Her eyes opened a little wider. She breathed out, weakly, "The bracelet." Ethan quickly stepped forward. Pulling the silver bracelet from his jacket pocket, he held it with both hands, gently, as if afraid of breaking a memory. "Yes, it belongs to my mother. I kept it to remind myself, never to stay silent about a mistake." Elena stared at the bracelet. Then, with her last strength, she raised her frail hand, not to take it, but to lightly touch Ethan's hand holding it. A touch as light as a feather, but it carried the weight of 20 years of waiting, of forgiveness, of silence. She smiled faintly. "Thank you, son." for bringing it back. With that, she closed her eyes. Her breath was weak, but more peaceful than before. Ethan stood there, feeling the fragile warmth lingering in his hand. He understood he couldn't reclaim the past, but he could heal the present. He couldn't fix what his father had done, but he could rewrite how the ward name would be remembered. He stayed until Elena fell into a deep sleep. When he turned to leave, Lena walked him to the door. Her face was still tired, but her eyes were less guarded. "I will come back tomorrow," he said. "If you don't mind," Lena replied softly, her voice no longer cold. "Tomorrow my mother has physical therapy. She hates it. It's very painful." Ethan nodded. "I understand. I will bring something to help her feel more comfortable." She watched him as he walked down the long corridor, the white light illuminating his back, no longer the posture of a powerful man, but of a person learning to take responsibility. For the first time, Lena didn't see an enemy. She only saw a man who knew how to bow his head to the truth. But while Ethan walked away with faint hope, he didn't know that the painful physical therapy session Lena mentioned would be the moment that determined the fate of all three of them. One breath, two, could be the final goodbye. The next day, Ethan didn't arrive at the hospital with lawyers or complicated plans. He walked into the room holding an old cream-colored radio and a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. He didn't knock, just gently pushed the door open. As if the place were his to enter, Lena was preparing to help her mother move into a wheelchair for physical therapy. She saw Ethan and what he brought, her eyes briefly surprised, and then a strange emotion appeared in her gaze. But she said nothing, just gave a slight nod in greeting. Ethan placed the bouquet in the empty vase on the table and carefully set the radio on the bedside cabinet. He plugged it in and searched for a station, finally settling on the classical piece, Clair de Lune. The soothing piano melody spread, calming the tense atmosphere in the room. Elena, tired but sitting up, turned to look at the radio, then at Ethan. A faint smile crossed her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan just nodded slightly. "I thought it might help." The physical therapy session was as Lena had described. Painful. Every movement caused Elena to wince in discomfort. Every breathing exercise required her to strain. Lena stood beside her, holding her mother's hand tightly, trying to appear strong, but the worry was evident in her eyes. Ethan stood in a corner of the room, observing silently. When Elena's coughing became severe, he stepped closer and turned up the volume on the radio. The gentle melody spread, soothing her cough. She took a deep breath, focused on the music, and slowly, the cough subsided. She continued the exercise. This time, seemingly supported by some invisible strength, Lena looked up, her eyes meeting Ethan's. In that moment, there was no distinction between rich and poor. Not painful past. Only a silent understanding between two people sharing a burden. After Elena drifted off to sleep, Lena and Ethan walked out into the hallway. "Thank you," Lena said. This time the gratitude carried a different weight. "For staying. I didn't do much," Ethan replied. "You did more than you think," Lena said softly. "You brought the music back. My mother hasn't listened to the radio in a long time." They walked to the hospital cafeteria, a noisy place, smelling of coffee and disinfectant. Ethan bought 2 hot coffees, and they sat down at a small table in the corner. "Why are you doing all this?" Lena asked. Here, gaze direct, meeting his eyes. "It's not just responsibility. There's something else." Ethan looked into his coffee cup, the rising steam blurring his reflection. "Because when your mother looks at me, she sees an image of my mother, not my father. I want to be worthy of that look." He looked up at her. "And because when I'm here, I feel like I'm doing something real. More than all the contracts and parties I've ever attended." Lena was silent, watching him. The man she had once scorned was now sitting before her, exposed with his own inner turmoil. Suddenly, Ethan's phone vibrated. It was Michael. "Sir." The legal team has finalized the procedures for the Silver Circle Foundation. We have a preliminary list of 6 fire victim families. They are all living in difficult circumstances and need medical assistance. Michael paused. But sir, we have a problem. Reaching out and convincing them to trust a charity bearing the ward name will be very difficult. We need someone who can connect with them. Someone who understands their pain. Ethan was silent, contemplating. An idea suddenly sparked in his mind. This was not just a solution, it was the only path. He hung up and turned to Lena. His gaze was no longer one of remorse, but a solemn proposal. Lena, he said, his voice firm. I need your help. Lena frowned. Help you? The Silver Circle Foundation cannot operate without the trust of the victims. They won't trust me, but they will trust you, he said, his eyes resolute. You understand them? You are part of this story. I want you not just to be the one being helped. I want you to lead it. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes earnest. I want to invite you to co-manage this foundation with me, not out of pity, but because no one in this world is better suited than you. I can't do this alone. Lena stared at him, stunned, unsure how to answer. Agreeing meant facing the past every day, but refusing meant abandoning 6 other families who were suffering the same pain as her mother and her. For the first time, their futures were no longer 2 parallel lines. They had just intersected at a single point. But while Ethan walked away with faint hope, he didn't know that the painful physical therapy session Lena mentioned would be the moment that determined the fate of all 3 of them. Lena didn't answer Ethan's proposal immediately. She quietly stood up and returned to the hospital room. Her subsequent action wasn't a verbal reply, but the way she sat down beside her mother's bed, held her hand, and recounted everything. She told her about the Silver Circle Foundation, about the 6 other families, and about Ethan's invitation. She told her not to seek advice, but as if seeking peace within her own story. Elena listened, her eyes no longer cloudy, but unusually clear. When Lena finished, she gently squeezed her daughter's hand. She said nothing, only turned her head to look at the bouquet of white chrysanthemums Ethan had brought, then at the radio, still playing soothing melodies. Sometimes, acceptance doesn't require words. The next day, Ethan received his answer. Lena didn't call. She only sent a short text message. I agree, but on one condition. They met at the foundation's temporary office. A small, simple space. Far from the luxury of ward atelier, Lena stood there, no longer the timid waitress or the suffering victim. She was a woman who had found her purpose. My condition is, she said, looking straight into Ethan's eyes. This foundation will not just provide material support. It must bring healing. And the first healing must begin with your own family. Ethan didn't understand. What do you mean? I want your mother to participate with us. Lena explained. She is also a victim of silence. She has lived 20 years with the burden of a savior who didn't know she also needed saving. I want her to personally hand out the new bracelets as a way to close the circle. The depth of Lena's thought stunned Ethan. She wasn't just thinking about revenge or demanding justice. She was thinking about reconciliation. He nodded, a genuine respect rising in his heart. I understand. That is an excellent condition. And so they began. The work was not easy. They traveled together to poor neighborhoods, knocking on doors one by one. Initially, they were chased away. The name Ward was too great a scar. But Lena was patient. She didn't talk about money. She talked about her mother. She showed them her old silver bracelet. She told their story. Not as a foundation representative, but as someone who had lived through it. Ethan was always by her side. But he stayed in the background. He learned to be silent and listen, allowing Lena's story to be the bridge. Gradually, doors began to open. Tears, hugs, and fragile trust began to build. During those months, their relationship slowly changed too. They were no longer the offender and the victim. They were companions. They shared rushed meals in the car, sleepless nights completing paperwork, and moments of quiet together when a long day ended. He saw in her an extraordinary resilience, and she saw in him a sincere change from deep within. Love didn't come to them with a romantic declaration, but with hundreds of small acts of care and respect. The official launch ceremony for the Silver Circle Foundation was held not in a five-star hotel, but at a small community center. There was no flashy press. Only the members of the 6 families and those who had supported them. The highlight of the ceremony was when Catherine, pushed in a wheelchair by Ethan, stepped onto the stage. Elena's health had improved slightly, enough for her to attend. She sat in the front row, next to Lena. Catherine, with the help of an interpreter, recounted the story of the 3 silver bracelets. Then she opened a new wooden box. Inside were not money, but finely crafted silver bracelets, each engraved with the name of a member of the victim families. Catherine, with her trembling hands, personally presented the first bracelet to the young grandchild of one of the families. In that moment, the circle of guilt from the past was closed by a circle of hope. After the ceremony, Ethan and Lena stood together on the balcony, looking down at the crowd chatting and laughing below. The streetlights illuminated their faces, warm and peaceful. "My mother said," Lena began, her voice soft as a whisper, "she has forgiven your father." Ethan was silent for a long moment. "My mother, too. She said she can finally forgive herself." He turned to look at her, his eyes holding everything he couldn't put into words. He gently took her old silver bracelet from his pocket. "I think it's time to put it back where it belongs." He took her hand, but instead of putting the bracelet on her wrist, he linked it with an identical new bracelet, forming 2 intertwined circles, the past and the present. He said softly, "The pain and the healing, we cannot separate them. Just like you and me." Lena looked at the 2 intertwined bracelets, then looked up at him, her eyes sparkling. She said nothing, only stood on her tiptoes and placed a light kiss on his lips. It was a kiss without burning passion, only profound peace. From a distance, Catherine and Elena sat side by side, watching their children. The 2 women, one unable to hear, one struggling to breathe, were communicating with each other in a common language without words. The smile of contentment. The final circle had closed, not with luxurious fairy tale ending, but with the image of 2 silver bracelets intertwined, simple and sincere. Our journey began with the clinking of crystal glasses and a careless sneer, only to end in the profound peace of 2 hearts that had learned to listen. The story of Ethan and Lena is not just about love, but a testament to a deeper truth. The value of a person lies not in what they possess, but in the scars they carry and how they heal others. The $10 silver bracelet, once a symbol of contempt at a lavish dinner, ultimately became a priceless legacy, a compass guiding a journey of atonement. It reminds us that sometimes the smallest and most silent things hold the greatest stories. Ethan couldn't use money to erase the past, but he used his presence, his patience, and a listening heart to write a more worthy new chapter. That is true salvation. Perhaps the greatest message the Silver Circle leaves behind is the most powerful healing doesn't come from forgetting, but from confronting and understanding. In our own lives, perhaps each of us has our own silver bracelet, a keepsake, a pain, or a story we keep hidden. The question I want to leave with you today is, have you ever paused to truly listen to the story behind someone's silver bracelet, or your own? Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. I wish you always find listening hearts around you, and that you too become such a heart. See you in the next stories.